Hey, I'm Jim Dewey, and this is Combating the Narrative. So, in my estimation, the reason that this country and the West has found itself in the particular predicament it's currently in, and those of us on the right side of the aisle have been losing for decades and decades, is because we have a tendency to be reactionary instead of proactive. We're constantly focused on the negative, and the progressives keep us on the backpedal. And this has clearly been an ineffective tactic because what have we managed to conserve? Nothing. Virtually every institution we once held dear has been rotted from the inside out. In combating the narrative, yes, I must focus on the claims of my opponents, but I also must submit my own as well. It's not enough to simply destroy. If we want to effect any meaningful political change, we need to create as well. And that's why I'm creating this new video series, tentatively titled Historical Archetypes and Embodiments of Virtue. I want to present deeds and men from history that we can take pride in, and not just take pride in, but aspire to be like. So the tentative pattern of my channel from here on out will be, if I'm parrying an argument from men like Atun-Shei or Bad Empanada on a particular subject, I'm going to strike back with my own video, highlighting any virtuous action I can find. And being that my most popular video to date has been my video on Atun-Shei and the American Civil War, I think that's a fitting place to start. Much attempt has been made by the American left and progressive movement to vilify the American Confederacy, so let's take a look at the virtues of the Confederacy. Men who acquitted themselves admirably in a very difficult situation. These are men who exhibited bravery, cunning, courage, audacity, willingness to endure every hardship and privation, military prowess, self-sacrifice, and idealism. Would that more men who exhibited these qualities existed today. Now, I won't go into any great detail about the causes which impelled the South to separate from the North. I feel I've done that in my other videos on the topic, which I'll link here. It should suffice to say that this was a collective of men who felt that they were about to be trampled underfoot by men who did not represent their interests. I should sincerely doubt any serious historian would disagree with that statement. So what did these men do about it? Did they sit back and trust the plan and wait for Jefferson Davis and QAnon to save them? Did they make idle threats about how they'd use the Second Amendment if it ever came to it? If some ever-changing red line in the sand had been crossed? No. You know what they did? First, they honestly appraised their situation. They came to the conclusion that the previous 70 years of negotiation had failed. They were rapidly losing political power, which they would never regain, and they realized they were left with a choice. They could continue to operate within the current power structure, maybe make a lot of noise and raise a hell of a racket in Congress, while slowly but surely they were trodden underfoot, who were indifferent to their interests at best and hated them at worst. And that indeed would have been the easier option. They could have just as easily have kicked the problem down the road and let their children deal with it. After all, the South did retain some political power, and it's an awful thing to risk death or great bodily harm. Or they could do the difficult thing, face their problems despite all the danger, and secede, even though it may have meant signing their own death warrants. And that decision is easy in retrospect. We know, in hindsight, that Robert E. Lee, Beauregard, Jackson, Bragg were the scourge of the continent for nigh on 5 years, how the Confederacy was able to launch expeditionary military campaigns into Union territory, how the Southern soldiers seemed to come out on top for most of the war. We know how close the Confederacy came to success. We can talk about how if only Confederate plans didn't fall into McClellan's hands before the Battle of Antietam, or if only Lee hadn't ordered Pickett's charge, or if McClellan had beat Lincoln in the '64 election, as he initially seemed very likely to do, the Confederacy would have won the war. And I'm by no means denying that, but it almost seems to undercut exactly how much the Confederacy did with so little, and it undermines the bravery of calling for secession. Now, as an aside, I'd like to address a couple of things here. My opinions on the decisions taken by the Confederate States at that point in time should by no means be extrapolated to the present day. And in my last video, which condemned the idea that we should sit and wait for the government to overreach and then engage in some sort of guerrilla-type insurrection in this country, is a condemnation of that particular type of war and how it has led to political inaction from the right. There's a difference between being complacent until you have lost all institutional power and then trying to start a war versus consolidating what political power you have left in a block of states and then seceding or engaging in a national divorce. If you're interested in my thoughts on that, I'll link it here. With that, let's place ourselves in the shoes of the Confederacy, or what would become the Confederacy, in November of 1860, just after the election of Lincoln. A radical, someone diametrically opposed to the things you need, want, and believe, has won a national election. What's more, is even if the election hadn't been split between 4 candidates, even if you combined all the electoral votes of the other candidates that had won in southern states, you still don't have enough to overcome the block of political power in the northern states. The writing is on the wall. On the national level, your goose is cooked. Nobody on the national stage will ever represent your interests again. So what do? How do you maintain a system of governance of, by, and for your people? Do you even do so at all? It would be just as easy, in fact easier, to accept, albeit begrudgingly, your defeat. While use of military force against you by the federal government and the Union is not a foregone conclusion, it seems pretty darn likely, especially given what had happened about 30 years prior during the nullification crisis. On March 1st, 1833, Congress passed what was called the Force Bill, authorizing President Jackson to use force against the state of South Carolina to enforce tariffs and prevent secession. And even if your state secedes, how many will stand with you? Will any stand with you? Will you stand alone against the rest of the Union? And so, rather than rolling over and accepting defeat, or compromising on uncompromisable things, on the 24th of December, 1860, South Carolina declares that it intends to secede from the Union. Shortly thereafter, South Carolina was joined by Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, Texas, Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina. But this is just the beginning of the fight, not the end. The die is cast, the Rubicon has been crossed, and war is on the horizon. Now, the men in leadership positions of the Confederacy were not fools. Many had served in either the Indian Wars, the Mexican-American War, or both. They knew that bravery alone was not enough to sustain an army. The trials and tribulations of the American expedition into Mexico had ingrained in the minds of those who had fought there that old axiom: an army marches on its stomach, and indeed armies have an insatiable appetite. And at the outset of this war, what did this fledgling nation have to sustain their army? What did they have at their disposal to mount an effective defense of their nation? The total population of the Confederacy was, at this point in time, 5.5 million free men and 3.5 million enslaved. Compare that to the 18.5 million in the Union. Now, I will agree with my modern historian counterparts like Atun-Shei that no, there's no substantial evidence that there were black Confederates. Now, in some instances, yes, slaves were used within the context of a military campaign, so doing menial tasks like digging trenches or preparing for sieges and that sort of thing. But bear in mind that these 3.5 million slaves could be just as much a hindrance as they were a help to the Confederate cause. Keep in mind that one of the things that terrified the Confederacy into secession and made them terrified of things like immediate manumission of their slaves was the idea of a slave revolt. Violent slave revolts like the one in Haiti, or John Brown's attempted slave revolt, or Nat Turner's slave revolt, were not only on the forefront of the minds of slaveholders in the Confederacy, but of very real potentiality. This is why it was famously said that slavery is like holding a wolf by the ears. You don't like it, but you dare not let it go. So valuable military resources would have to be dedicated to ensuring that there was no uprising among the slaves. And so, this population disparity allowed the Union to field an army 2 to 3 times as large as the Confederate army, and still man their factories and fields. Which brings me to the economic systems and structures of these two nations. 69% of the Confederate population were employed as farmers, and it was largely not foodstuffs that they were producing. The Confederate States produced cotton, tobacco, sugarcane, and other cash crops for export. Most of the food production of the United States was in Northern Territory. As far as factories go, the Confederacy only possessed 21,000 factories. Compare that to the 101,000 in the North. And the factories in the North were producing a lot more value. The Confederacy had a total value of products amounting to $155 million. Compare that to the $1.5 billion in the northern states. Specifically in terms of manufacture of war materiel, the Confederacy basically had to start from scratch. In inventory, the Confederate States possessed some 175,000 shoulder arms, most of which, 140,000, were obsolete smoothbore firearms. The Confederate Navy, at the outset of the war, possessed 14 seaworthy vessels. Only one foundry in all of the Confederacy, in the border state of Virginia, was capable of producing heavy guns, and this is to say nothing of factories that produced other war materiel that we don't think about. Canteens, bandages, boots, uniforms, socks, saddles, spurs, etc., etc. And even if the Confederacy could tool up factories overnight, which is a big if, they would still be reliant on the importation of raw materials from outside the Confederacy. This is difficult to do when you have a navy comprised of 14 ships. The Confederacy would find itself reliant on privateers, issued letters of marque and reprisal, and blockade runners to try to import what little raw materials and manufactured goods to the Confederacy they could get their hands on. This is to say nothing of the fact that this was an export-based economy, and a blockade would cripple that economy. Internally, the Confederacy also lacked important infrastructure necessary for the conduct of a war. Whether on the offensive or defensive, rapid transportation of troops and supplies is very important. The same goes through communication, through telegraph wire. The Confederacy possessed 9,500 miles of rail at the time war broke out. Most of these rail lines were less than 100 miles long, and importantly, they were oriented on an east-west axis in order to get raw materials to ports for export. Furthermore, much of the rail lines in the Confederacy lacked a standardized railroad gauge being the distance between the tracks. Now, this means that steam engines used across the Confederacy were often not compatible with rail lines. And being that the population of the Confederacy was much smaller, and a much greater percentage of the population would be sucked directly into the war effort, there was a much smaller population base that was able to maintain or expand these rail lines. Compare that to the 22,000 miles of expansive and well-maintained railroads in the Union. The disparity in telegraph wire was even more stark. The Confederacy possessed 5,000 miles of telegraph wire, whereas the Union possessed 45,000 miles of telegraph wire. And this isn't meant to be a complete list of all the advantages the Union had over the Confederacy, but rather a cross-section of some important advantages. And in spite of this, when the time for choosing came, when, after 4 months of negotiation, federal troops refused to withdraw from Fort Sumter, did this disparity in the capacity of these two nations to wage war stop the Confederacy from stepping up, doing what's hard, doing what's required, and firing on the forces of a superior nation who had refused the olive branch of peace and continued to occupy Confederate territory? No. P.G.T. Beauregard, with full knowledge of what I've just mentioned, still orders the firing on a foreign occupational force, and in so doing, kicks off the war. Now, by all rights, the war should have been over quickly. Virtually the only advantage the Confederacy possessed at this point in time was the fact that much of the fighting likely was going to be taking place on their own territory, an advantage which is rapidly negated when your economy is geared towards producing cash crops, your people are starving, manufactured goods are in such scarcity as to be impossible to come by, and your enemy is willing to wage a total war. The Confederacy should have been swept aside, drowning in a sea of blue uniforms within a year. Instead, Napoleon's axiom that the moral is to the physical as 3 is to 1 was proved. Under-equipped, ill-trained men, time and time again, defeated superior forces, and I won't go into great detail on specific campaigns in which this was demonstrated, unless you guys want me to. I could make a series out of it. But by war's end, the Confederacy had only narrowly lost, eventually succumbing to Union industrial and numerical superiority after the war had dragged on almost 5 years, and their ability to wage war had been diminished to almost nothing. And even then, after the smoke had cleared and the dust had settled, the Confederacy had still inflicted a significantly higher number of casualties on the Union. Despite numerical inferiority, the strong men of the Confederacy had only been brought to heel after they were bootless, starving, without ammunition, and the Union had all but razed their country to the ground and salted the earth. If we were to exhibit these same characteristics today, we'd be unstoppable.